A poor widow found a stitched map buried deep in her dead husband's mine. Then a wealthy stranger rode in, claiming the land was his. But what she uncovered in the shaft would expose a lie buried for generation. Rain had been falling for 3 straight days in the hills outside Dry Creek, but it wasn't enough to wash away the dust that clung to the bones of the past. In a hollow near the jagged cliffs, once scorched by gunpowder and grief, a weathered shack stood like a scar on the land. Inside, a woman named Clara Tate moved like someone who'd made peace with the silence, her shawl soaked at the shoulders. Her hands blistered and her breath just short of surrender. They called her the Widow Tate, and it wasn't out of respect. It was a name folks used when they'd long stopped believing someone had a future. Her husband, Elijah, had died too, winters earlier in a cave-in while searching for silver no one had ever seen. He died with a pickaxe in one hand and a dream in the other. Buried beneath rocks that whispered nothing but cold, Clara had been left with nothing but a ledger of unpaid debts. 2 mules and a scar on her thigh from the day they pulled his body. Out still she stayed. Some called it foolishness. Others thought it was grief. But the truth buried deeper than the veins of ore. Her husband once swore lay beneath the land was that Clara had nowhere else to go. The mine shaft behind her home had been boarded up after the accident, and the town council had declared it a death site. No one was allowed near it. But Clara returned each morning, moving rocks one by one, whispering apologies to Elijah as she scraped through the soil. She wasn't mining, she was mourning. Until the morning. Her shovel struck something that didn't sound like rock or bone. It was wrapped in oilskin and stuffed into a rusted metal canister wedged behind a timber support. The moment she opened it, the world seemed to still. Inside was a map not drawn on parchment but stitched onto deerskin with precision. It marked a location to ridges south where no one dared go because of the cougar sightings. There were coordinates, hand-drawn notes, and a name she recognized but hadn't heard in years, Jebediah. Knox, the name of the man who once cheated Elijah out of half his land in a whiskey-fueled poker game. The man who left town before the mine boom. The man who swore there was silver but never dug for it himself. Clara didn't know what frightened her more, that the map was real, or that someone had hidden it so deep they never intended it to be found. She didn't sleep that night. By lantern light, she traced the route over and over, her calloused fingers shaking every time they passed over the initials EK, Elijah's signature, hidden in the bottom corner like a secret prayer. She knew then this was no coincidence. Elijah had known about the claim, maybe even planned to dig there before he died. But he'd hidden it, perhaps to keep it safe. Perhaps because he knew someone would come for it. And come they did, 2 mornings later, as Clara prepared her pack and kissed the locket she never removed. A sound echoed from the ridge. Hooves. Not the soft clatter of a farm horse, but the thunder of a stallion trained for speed, not labor. The rider dismounted before she could make out his face, but his voice cold, sharp, and without apologies, poke like a stone dropped into still water. He had the papers, he had the land deed. He said this mine, the shaft, the soil beneath her boots, none of it was hers, and he had come to claim it. He called himself Knox, not Jebediah but Everett, his son. Young, clean-shaven, and confident, in the way only inherited men could be. He wore a vest stitched with gold thread and boots that had never touched coal. The townsfolk followed behind him like dust in his wake, watching the scene unfold without offering a word. Clara held the map in her hand, but he held the law in his. She saw it in the folded documents he waved without hesitation. Land grants, probate letters, signatures of a man long dead who had once claimed everything in this county with a lie. Clara didn't weep. She didn't scream. She only nodded as if she'd expected this moment her whole life. Because, in some ways, she had. The only question now wasn't whether she'd lose the land. It was how far the truth would sink before it rose again. And when it did, whether justice would ride in with Itor, burn everything down in its path. Clara didn't return to her cabin that night. Instead, she sat by the fire near the edge of the old mine shaft. Map clenched in her hands like a weapon the law couldn't see. The townsfolk had already begun whisperings, some saying she was crazy, others warning Knox would bring the marshal next. But Clara knew something they didn't. That map wasn't just old, it was sacred. It had Elijah's soul sewn into it, and no man riding a fine horse and quoting deed papers would ever know what that meant. While the world slept, she reread every marking, every line, every number. She memorized the curves and terrain as if she were learning a song her husband had once hummed under his breath when he still believed the ground could give more than it took by dawn. Clara had packed 2 days' worth of supplies, tied her hair with the same strip of ribbon Elijah gave her before the war, and took the trail toward the marked location. Her boots bled on the rock, but she didn't slow. There were no markers, no signposts, just instinct and the pull of something ancient whispering from under the soil. At the base of a shale ridge shaped like a broken jaw, she found it. A series of boulders and twisted cedar trees guarding a small alcove that even sunlight seemed reluctant to touch. She crouched low, brushed away moss, and found what she prayed for, a faint X, chiseled crudely into the stone. She wasn't a geologist, but the glittering streak across the crackling rock face told her enough. It wasn't gold, but it was silver. Raw, uncut, and real. She cried. Not from joy, but from rage. Elijah had been right. All those nights of calloused hands and bleeding fingers, of empty plates and colder winters, he had been right. And now the son of the man who once stole everything from them had returned to do it again, but with cleaner boots and legal papers. Clara didn't care what his name was or what courthouse had stamped that deed. She knew one thing with the certainty of a mother holding her dead child: this land was paid for in more than coin. It was paid for in blood. But as she moved to mark the spot on her copy of the map, the wind shifted. A shadow passed behind her. She turned and froze. A stranger stood by the ridge trail. Not Knox, but someone older. Worn by sun, leather-skinned, hat pulled low. He didn't speak, but he watched with the kind of stillness that made your chest tighten. Clara stood and faced him, but he didn't move. He just tipped his head slightly, then turned and vanished into the brush like a ghost with a memory. Clara would later swear that he was real, not a vision, but something told her he wasn't just a wanderer. Someone had been watching the mine for years. Maybe someone who once knew Elijah, or someone who knew exactly what lay under this ridge long before she found the map. She returned to town before sundown. The atmosphere had changed. People avoided her eyes. Knox's men had already staked flags along her property's border, and a hired land surveyor's wagon was parked in her front yard. She wasn't even allowed to enter her own home. When she demanded entry, they pointed to a posted writ nailed into the fence post: an injunction pending a land rights hearing. It meant she couldn't step foot past the gate until the judge decided. A judge who lived 3 counties away. With no reason to side with a dirt-covered widow over a man in gold-rimmed spectacles. That night, Clara slept behind the church, curled against the wall like an outlaw. But she wasn't planning revenge. She was planning evidence. The law had taken everything once before when it had no reason to listen. This time, she'd give them reason. She began copying every inch of the map. She visited the blacksmith's widow, an old friend of Elijah's who remembered the poker game that lost him the deed. She found a letter Elijah had written months before his death, a letter describing a rich vein I dare not dig yet. Not until I make sure they can't steal it again. That was all she needed. But Knox wasn't idle. By morning, he'd already sent word to the county recorder's office. He knew Clara wouldn't go quietly, and he was ready. She might have had a husband buried under rock, but he had lawyers, guns, and money, and something worse: time. Because Clara knew if she didn't act fast, the land would be stripped, the vein gutted, and her name lost like dust in the shaft where Elijah died. And maybe that was why the stranger had appeared at the ridge, because someone, somewhere, wanted the truth to rise again, even if it meant the earth had to open itself and scream. 2 days after Clara was locked out of her own land, the mine ridge came alive. Knox's men moved in with gear, ropes, pulleys, and drilling kits. No official excavation had been granted yet, but he wasn't waiting for verdicts. He was establishing proof of possession, something Clara had heard of only in court whispers and land dispute tales. The technique was simple. If you could show you had already improved the land-erected stakes, brought in men, made cuts, you could claim you'd been in rightful ownership before the dispute ever began. It was dirty law. But dirtier still was how fast the town seemed to back Knox, not because they believed him, but because he had money. He offered to fix the school roof. He promised the general storekeeper a new shipment of flour and nails, spot rounds at the saloon, and handed out coins like crumbs to pigeons. The preacher even gave a sermon about the blessing of industry and how the Lord sometimes worked through outsiders to restore broken towns. Clara watched from the churchyard shadows, as the same people who once left soup on her porch now looked away when her eyes met theirs. Her grief had become inconvenient, but Clara wasn't built to weep anymore. That part of her had died with Elijah. Instead, she loaded a borrowed mule, packed food, water, and documents, and rode out before dawn to the old courthouse in Bear Hollow, a 2-day journey through snake-slick canyons and cliff trails that swallowed daylight by noon. There, she would request a certified copy of Elijah's old land plot, the one filed before the poker game that gave Knox's father half the ridge. If she could prove Elijah's claim predated that fraud, she might stall the process. Even better, she could find the missing portion, the part her husband said was hidden. She could expose Knox as a liar before he laid hands on the vein. But the courthouse was a coffin of old paper and tired eyes. The clerk, an old man with fingers like twigs, took half a day just to find the original filings. Worse, Elijah's name was listed, but the signature was incomplete, as if someone had ripped off the corner of the document. Clara stared at it in disbelief. Elijah had always signed in full, careful and firm. But this, it had been tampered with. And it didn't end there. In the county archive ledger, a record showed that 3 years ago, months after Elijah's death, someone claiming to be next of kin had accessed his property file. A man named Everett Knox. Clara's blood turned to ice. She rushed back. Her mule near collapse when she reached Dry Creek and found her cabin's door splintered and open, not looted, searched. Every drawer dumped, every paper gone. They hadn't taken anything of value, but everything of memory. The only thing they missed was what she always kept with her, Elijah's locket and the stitched map, now wrapped and hidden inside her boot lining. The next day, Clara stood before the town council, dusty and shaking but unbowed. She demanded a hearing, not in this town, but in Bear Hollow. She accused Everett Knox of forgery, land fraud, and theft of property from a widow. She laid down copies of the forged files, affidavits from Elijah's blacksmith friend, and her husband's hidden letter. And then she did what no one expected. She handed over the map, not the original, but a carefully aged duplicate, enough to draw attention to trigger an investigation. Because Clara knew something even Knox didn't, that the real location of the silver was mismarked. Elijah had known someone might steal it. He'd shifted the coordinates on the map by just enough to fool a greedy man, so true vein was still safe, hidden behind a false X, 200 paces northeast. Clara alone knew the truth, but it wasn't over that evening. As she walked through the graveyard to visit Elijah's stone, she saw the shadow again. The same man from the ridge. This time, he didn't vanish. He left something behind, an envelope. Nailed to the chapel door. Inside was a photo of Elijah with 2 other men. One was the blacksmith. The other was Jebediah Knox. And scrawled in faded ink on the back were 5 words. He lied to both of you. Clara stared at it until the wind ripped it from her hand and carried it into the dark. Whatever she thought she knew about the past, it was just the surface and the truth. Like silver, ran deeper. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat with her boots on, lantern flickering beside her, and the photograph in her lap. The wind had tossed it across the graves and into a patch of damp grass, but she'd chased it like it was Elijah's last breath. Her fingers traced the faded ink again and again. "He lied to both of you." The words didn't just echo, they pressed into her chest like stones. If Jebediah Knox had lied not just to Elijah, but to someone else in that photograph, then someone out there might hold the missing piece to this whole tangle. A man who knew what happened the night Elijah lost half his land. By sunrise, Clara rode out again. She found the blacksmith's widow sweeping her porch, the morning sun painting long gold shadows over the dusty path. Clara showed her the photo, and the woman froze. "That's Henry Mott," she said, "Elijah's best friend back in the early days before the mine. He'd left town years ago after the accident that killed his youngest brother in a rigged dynamite blast. A blast people had whispered might have been sabotage, though no one had dared say whose hand lit the fuse." Clara tracked Henry to a logging camp north of Mud Creek. It took another 2 days. A near fall off a frostbitten ridge, and a night spent under tarpaulin in a storm that nearly took her mule. But when she arrived, a man with a gray beard and one missing thumb looked her straight in the eye and said, "You're Elijah's girl, okay?" And that was all she needed to know, he remembered. Inside his cabin, surrounded by wood chips and the smell of pine sap, Henry told her what Elijah never could. Jebediah Knox hadn't just tricked Elijah into a bad card game. He'd orchestrated the whole thing. The whiskey had been laced, the cards marked, the dealer bought. Elijah never had a chance. But more than that, Jebediah had known about the silver all along. He'd discovered it first, years before. But he was too greedy to mine it himself. He wanted someone else to do the work, to take the risk, to build the shaft. Elijah had been that man. Henry hadn't said anything back then because he feared for his life. After the rigged game, he tried to confront Jebediah only to find his brother's body the next morning, bayed under rock from a spontaneous collapse. He left Dry Creek that day and never looked back. Until now, Clara returned with his sworn statement. A signed and notarized document that said Jebediah Knox was the original fraud, and that Everett's entire claim was built on stolen ground. But the hearing in Bear Hollow was still days away. And Clara knew Knox wouldn't wait that long to move in. She was right. When she returned to Dry Creek, the ridge had changed. Fencing had gone up. Armed men patrolled the outer edges of her old land. Miners hired from the next county had begun digging where the false X pointed. Clara almost laughed when she saw it. Knox was wasting time and money on the wrong location. But that didn't mean she was safe. Men like him didn't accept failure. They dug harder when they failed. They buried the truth if it meant saving their name. That evening, she caught a boy no older than 12 sneaking near the true site with a set of surveying tools too big for his hands. She chased him down, pinned him against a rock, and found a letter in his back pocket. A sketch of the real map. Not the one she had forged, but her original, stitched one. He stuttered out that he worked for Mr. Knox, but wouldn't say more. She let him go, but she realized her secret was out. Someone had seen her with the real map. And if Knox knew where the silver actually lay, he'd rip the entire mountain down to find it. Clara had one option left. She went to the preacher. She didn't beg. She didn't explain. She just placed the map, the affidavits, the photo, and Henry's statement into a satchel and asked him to deliver them personally to the magistrate in Bear Hollow before the hearing. "Don't let them touch this," she said. "Not even the sheriff." Then she returned to the ridge, alone. No weapons, no plans. Just a rope, her husband's locket, and a stack of dynamite Elijah had stored in the barn before he died leftover. Maybe, or intended for the very dig he never lived to complete. She waited until midnight. Then she lowered herself into the true vein. The shaft was narrow, lined with jagged stone and breathing silver mist. She climbed down past the beams Elijah once hammered in himself, her lantern slicing through darkness like a blade. At the base, she found it walls of untouched ore, shimmering like moonlight under skin. The silver was real. Her husband was, right? They'd taken his name, his land, his dignity, but not his truth. Above her, horses stirred, voices dot boots on gravel. They were coming, and this time she would not run. Clara pressed her back against the cold mine wall, heartbeat thudding louder than the pickaxe she'd once swung in silence. The flicker of her lantern cast long, shaky shadows that danced like spirits resurrected from the old earth. She was deep, in the belly of Elijah's dream, but now it felt more like his grave. The silver that glittered around her was no longer treasure, it was proof. Proof they had died for something real. Proof that this land was stolen. But it was also bait. And Knox had taken it. The voices above grew louder. Everett Knox had arrived, not with surveyors this time, but with men bearing rifles and dynamite. The kind of lawless strength that didn't ask permission or wait for court rulings. He didn't come to inspect the land, he came to claim it. Figured out the map was false, and someone, maybe that trembling boy Clara caught, had led him straight to the true vein. Now he was ready to make it disappear. If she was inside it when that happened, even better. From the base of the shaft, Clara heard the rattle of chain as they lowered something heavy. A lantern appeared first, followed by a gloved hand. A figure descended, slow and purposeful. Wasn't Knox. It was one of his men, a foreman with a scar slicing through his eyebrow and a pistol clipped tight to his belt. He didn't shout. He didn't ask if anyone was there. He just began setting a fuse. Clara stepped into view with the resolve of someone who had already decided she'd die if it meant ending the lie. The man froze when he saw her, just long enough for her to grab the lantern from his hand and smash it against the shaft wall. Flame burst in an arc, catching a hanging cloth bag on fire. The mine didn't ignite, but the scare worked. The man stumbled back and scrambled up the rope, shouting that the widow was down there and she's lit. The damn thing. But Clara wasn't finished. She took the second fuse from the bag and lit it not for destruction, but for alarm. The smoke would rise fast, thick, unnatural. She needed the town to see, to hear. She needed every man, woman, and child who had once eaten Elijah's bread or warmed by his fire to look toward the ridge and know something was happening that couldn't be ignored. The plan worked. By the time Knox himself arrived, gun drawn and face contorted with fury, the ridge was lined with townsfolk. The smoke had brought them out like bees from broken hives. The sheriff arrived too, panting and red-faced, and with him came the preacher, carrying the satchel Clara had given him. The documents, the photo, the map. "What's this?" Knox demanded, trying to wave the crowd back. "She's trespassing. This is a federal claim now. You're all witnesses." But the preacher stepped forward. "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Knox. These folks are witnesses. It's just not the kind you hoped for." The sheriff took the documents, flipping through them as the crowd pushed closer. Clara's voice, raspy, shaking, but sharp as a miner's chisel, let up from the shaft. "I'm here," she shouted, "and so is the truth." Knox tried to command his men to seal the shaft, but they hesitated. The foreman, who'd seen Clara's eyes in the dark, knew she wasn't bluffing. And worse, he'd seen something else. Silver, veins thick enough to bleed. Real enough to tempt, dangerous enough to damn. The sheriff finally spoke. "This land was never yours, Knox. Not legally. And not by blood. You stole it on your father's word, and now you're standing on the lie." Knox's mouth moved, but no words came. In that moment, he wasn't a land baron or heir to an empire. He was just a boy with dirty shoes standing on stolen ground. And Dry Creek, broken, starved, and bruised, had finally seen enough. The crowd surged forward, not with pitchforks, but with conviction. The schoolteacher called for justice. The blacksmith's widow raised her cane in the air and shouted Elijah's name. A teenage boy tossed a rock that landed at Knox's feet. A ripple of memory ran through the earth. Clara climbed out of the shaft alone. Her hands blistered, her cheeks stained with ash, but her eyes clear. She didn't need a victory parade. She just needed to be believed. The sheriff took Knox into custody, not for trespass, but for forgery and land fraud. A messenger was dispatched to Bear Hollow. The court date would be expedited, but as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the last of the smoke drifted over the silver-streaked ridge, Clara knew something deeper had shifted. The land no longer groaned beneath lies, it was breathing again. The trial in Bear Hollow came swift and cold like a frontier storm. But it didn't start with arguments, it started with silence. It's the kind of silence that stretches between generations, waiting for someone brave enough to speak. Clara stood alone before the magistrate in a borrowed dress and scuffed boots. Her hands stained with mine dust, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Behind her sat only a handful of townsfolk, people who had once turned away from her, but now leaned forward with every word she said. She laid out the map, the real one, still, stitched with Elijah's initials. She handed over the photograph with Jebediah Knox's lie scrawled on the back. She presented Henry Mott's sworn statement, signed in ink darker than blood. And she recounted, in a voice steady as iron, the day she found the ridge, the boy sent to spy. The smoke that brought a forgotten town to life. Knox's lawyer called. Her unwell, unqualified, a bitter widow, lost in grief. But when Everett Knox took the stand himself, something in his eyes betrayed him. He spoke with arrogance, but not conviction. He denied forging documents until the court clerk from Dry Creek testified that the county records office had logged his name accessing Elijah's file. He denied knowledge of the real vein until the surveyor, one of his own hires, admitted he had been sent to the exact spot Clara had discovered. Every lie cracked like frost under sun by the time the magistrate rose to declare judgment. The room held its breath. This court, he said, recognizes the original land rights of the late Elijah Tate, and rules that any transfers made under false pretense are null and void. Tate, the mine, and all contents beneath are restored to his surviving widow, Clara Tate. The gavel fell, not with thunder, but with grace. But justice didn't end there. The court ordered Knox held for investigation into multiple charges, including tampering with public records and conspiracy to defraud. And though his name had once walked on marble floors, it now clung to the backs of wanted posters that blew across 3 counties. His empire built on fiction and gold-threaded boots grumbled faster than the shale he tried to blast. Clara returned to Dry Creek in a wagon lent by a rancher who once ignored her at the market. This time the townsfolk didn't look away. Children ran beside her wheels. The preacher rang the bell long past dusk. And in front of her broken-down cabin stood a quiet crowd holding tool saws, nails, sacks of seed. They had come not to mourn her past, but to help her rebuild her future. She didn't make speeches. She walked past them. Through the crooked gate Knox's men once blocked and placed a small stone at the edge of the mine. It wasn't a marker of ownership. It was a grave, one for Elijah, one for the years stolen, one for the silence she had carried like a second skin. The mine was sealed not with boards, but with reverence. Clara sold a portion of the vein to a local mining cooperative under the condition that no one could dig without first hiring those who had once been left behind. The funds went to rebuild the school, fix the church bell, and open a widow's fund for women who had lost more than men ever knew. She didn't take a mansion or ride a gilded carriage. It's kept her home modest, her boots worn, her eyes watching the hills. And every spring, when the snow melted and the mountain breathed again, she planted white flowers near the ridge. Some said it was to honor Elijah. Others said it was a sign that the land had forgiven them all. But those who knew Clara Tate understood better. She hadn't won a battle. She had reclaimed a name. And in the place where greed once burrowed deep, frontier redemption had taken root in the shape of a widow, with nothing left to lose and everything buried finally risen.